The bottom is here, or at least it's near. 2023 will be a better year for sports card prices than most of you believe. I'll tell you why and show you the data next. Hello, sports card investors, and welcome to a year of optimism, of hope, a year that I believe will be much better for the sports card market than many of you believe that it will be. Because when I look around YouTube and social media right now, all I see are people saying that the sports card market is going to continue to crash. People are predicting that cards will continue to spiral downward in price. People believe that it is going to be another ugly year for the value of all of our collections. And I understand why you might think this way. Many cards, not all cards, but many cards have been in a total funk for almost 2 years. Now, there are exceptions, such as high-grade vintage cards, but most cards, and especially most modern and ultra-modern cards, fell hard for most of 2021 and all of 2022. So it's easy to think that this is going to continue to happen. We've seen prices fall for 2 years, so it's natural to fear the worst and assume prices will inevitably continue to fall. Plus, you have the potential of a recession around the corner, which makes it even easier to fear the worst for the sports card market in 2023. But if we all think logically about it, we know that sports cards are not going to zero. They will never go to zero. There will be a bottoming out point to the current price fall. And once the bottom of the market is reached, sports card prices will begin to rise again. Sports cards have a 50-plus year history of being a valuable asset. Now, there are many cards that will not have value in the future. For example, highly overprinted base cards, and especially cards of role players, they're not going to be worth much years down the road. But key cards, cards of stars and Hall of Famers that collectors desire and that don't have crazy high population counts, those cards have been valued for the last 50 years and they will be valued for the next 50 years and well beyond. I remain confident in sports cards as a long-term alternative asset investment, and there's no reason not to, as history has proven that highly desired sports cards can indeed be a good investment. But sky is falling thinking is pervasive right now, which makes it hard to think that we could be near the bottom of the market and that we could soon see a rise in sports card prices again. But I believe this is in fact the case. I think we're close to the bottom of the market if we're not already there. I think many key cards won't drop in value much more before they start to rise in value again. And to explain why I believe this, let me take you back to a much simpler day. March 10th of 2020. Right before the pandemic in America, when we were all blissfully ignorant about what the country was about to endure for the next 2 years. On March 10th of 2020, we were all looking forward to March Madness, which was just days away, and the start of the new baseball season was just around the corner. Little did we all know what was about to happen. And March 10th, 2020 was also a good time for the sports card market. The sports card market was doing really, really well before the pandemic. It had heated up in 2019 and it got hotter in early 2020. But we can all agree that the heat of the sports card market at that time in March of 2020 paled in comparison to how hot the sports card market became during the pandemic itself. We all know that the pandemic propelled sports cards to a fever pitch of popularity and to heights that we now know were not maintainable. So let's get rid of pandemic prices from our thinking. The pandemic was a once-in-a-lifetime event that rapidly exploded the popularity of sports cards, and it should be viewed as an aberration when looking at price charts. So in a moment, we're going to look at where sports card prices were right before the pandemic. Yes, on March 10th, 2020. And we're going to compare them to where they are today, as if the pandemic never occurred. But we all know that many of the new collectors and investors who got into sports cards during the pandemic continue to have interest in sports cards. Now, not all of them stuck around or will stick around, but many have and will. There is no doubt that there are far more people interested in sports cards today than there were on March 10th, 2020. There is evidence of this everywhere. Look how many collectors are active in online communities and social medias, and compare that to prior to the pandemic. Look at how many cards the grading companies are grading today and how many sales the marketplaces are making today, and compare those numbers to pre-pandemic. Look at attendance at card shows today and compare that to pre-pandemic. Look at the number of local card shops and compare that to pre-pandemic. Look at the money being invested into sports card businesses and apps and technologies today and compare that to pre-pandemic. Look at the following of all of our channels and many others and compare that to the level of interest that existed prior to the pandemic. Wherever you look and whatever metric you look at, it's very evident that there is way more heat in the sports card industry today, even after a 2-year price decline, than there was back before the pandemic on March 10th of 2020. So therefore, I believe that most key cards cannot possibly drop in price below where they were before the pandemic. And I don't think they'll even get very close to that level, because there are simply so many more people interested in cards today than there were back then. Despite the ups and downs of the last few years, demand is much higher today than it was on March 10th of 2020, and it will forever remain so. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, is up about 15% since March 10th of 2020. So at an absolute bare minimum, I think it's fair to say that most key cards will forever remain above their March 10th, 2020 price plus 15%, or whatever CPI adjusts to in the future. But I think the real price floor is well above that, because demand is so much higher and the market is so much larger than it was before the pandemic. I think the actual price floor is probably somewhere between 40% to 100% above March 10th of 2020 prices. Now, this may not apply to all cards. There are other factors at play that have to be considered, such as overprinting of ultra-modern cards, player performance since March of 2020, and the potential of an upcoming recession. But I do believe that my theory will apply and be proven accurate when looking at desired cards of many star players. So let's do this. Let's take a look now at the card values today of several key cards and compare them to the value of those same cards on March 10th of 2020. And let's see how close I think we are to the bottom of the market. So first, let's go over here to Market Movers and let's look at one of the most important cards of all time, the Michael Jordan 1986 Fleer card. And we're going to look at it in PSA 9 and PSA 10, or PSA 8 condition rather, not PSA 10 condition, because that's the super high end of the market. That's the ultra high end. And I recognize that those cards are unattainable for many collectors. I like to look at cards that have a higher transaction volume, but that are still important key cards that many collectors strive for. So we're going to look at this 86 Fleer Jordan in PSA 9 and PSA 8. And here on the graph, we're comparing March the 10th of 2020 all the way over here on the left through to today. If we switch to look at the details, you can see that the PSA 8 is up 110% since March 10th of 2020, right before the pandemic, and the PSA 9 is up 99.9%, so right at 100%. Now, my theory is that the floor is going to be somewhere between 40% and 100% of the March 10th, 2020 price. So that means that we are either right at the floor, and that is the lowest these cards will ever go, or they could go down a bit further, right? So like, let's take this PSA 9, for example, which is right at 100%, right? This card sold for $7,000 back in early March of 2020, and today is selling for right around $14,000. So that's right at double. So by my theory that the floor can't really go below 40% above what it was back then, that would put the floor around $10,000, just below $10,000 in my estimation for this card. I don't think you will ever see the PSA 9 Michael Jordan 1986 Fleer ever go below $10,000 again. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think the Michael Jordan 1986 Fleer PSA 9 will always remain above $10,000. Today, it is at $14,000. Could it go down to $10,000? It could happen. But I think the floor is somewhere between $10,000 and $14,000, and it's at $14,000 today. So I don't think it has a lot further to fall before it once again starts to rise. Let's look at one more basketball card. We're going to look at cards from all sports here, but let's look at Kobe's cards. Now, Kobe's cards are a little bit of a special exception because he passed away in late January of 2020. So his cards heated up as a result of that. A lot of collectors were rushing out and buying his cards in January 2020, February 2020, March of 2020. So his cards were actually already up a lot entering into the pandemic, more perhaps than may have been natural. So it may not be surprising then to see that his cards are up less than Jordan's cards when looking at where they were right before the pandemic than to today, because they were already a little high right before the pandemic. So his Topps Chrome base card in PSA 10 is 42% higher than it was at the start of the pandemic, and his Topps base card in PSA 10 is about 85% higher than it was at the start of the pandemic. So could these cards fall a little further? They absolutely could. Do I think they're going to fall a whole lot further? I don't. I think they could go down a little more, but not a whole lot more. Let's look at baseball. Let's look at Ken Griffey Jr.'s 1989 Upper Deck rookie card, one of the most iconic cards of all time. Let's look at it in PSA 10 and PSA 9. And you can see, by the way, all of these cards are following this same pattern on the graph. They're all rising here in the early stages of the pandemic, and then they're rising and rising, and then they're spiking right at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, and then they begin their almost 2-year descent in price ever since then. But even with that whole pattern, Ken Griffey Jr.'s cards, his PSA 10 is up 148% since the pandemic started, and his PSA 9 is up 111% since the pandemic started. Could these cards go down a little bit more? I do think they could. I think they could go down a little more. If the floor is double where it was prior to the pandemic, then these have a little bit more room to go down, and maybe the floor is a little bit below that. But once again, I don't think they're going to go down a lot more. This PSA 10 card was $700 before the pandemic. It's $1,700 today. I personally don't think that card will ever go below $1,000. Could it go down from $1,700 today to $1,000? It could, but I don't think that card's ever going to go below $1,000, and it probably won't go that low before it starts to go back up again. So we may not be at the floor yet, but I don't think the floor is too far away into the future. Let's look at Derek Jeter's rookie cards. I've got his 1993 Topps base card in PSA 10 and his SP foil card in PSA 8. His SP foil card is actually already 25% less than it was right before the pandemic. I'm not sure why that happened, but that is the case. Whereas his Topps base card is 60% more than it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. These could maybe go down a little bit further, but I don't see them going down much further. I have to think we're getting near the floor on Derek Jeter's cards if we're not there already. And we should look at vintage too. Vintage has been a totally different story in the market over the last couple of years. While so many modern and ultra-modern cards have been falling, vintage has remained strong and in some cases has actually gone up in value. It's harder to chart vintage because the cards sell a lot less often. But we're going to try. We're going to look at this card. This is Mickey Mantle's 1952 Topps base card in PSA 1 condition. So this is, a card that transacts more frequently because it's not as valuable as obviously higher grade Mantle 52 Topps cards are. This one is up 228% since the start of the pandemic. Once again, vintage cards have held stronger than modern and ultra-modern cards. Now, could this card stand to go down in value? It certainly could, because it's so much higher than it was at the start of the pandemic. At the same time, you've seen this shift in collector and investor mentality over the course of the last 2 years, where many people have been selling out of modern and ultra modern, and they have been buying vintage. People perceive vintage as the longer term, better investment. And as a result, vintage prices have remained strong. So as long as that mentality persists amongst collectors and investors, you're probably going to see the vintage card market continue to do well. And of course, many of these vintage cards are very low population compared to their modern and ultra modern counterparts, which really helps because there's not that much supply. So if there's a lot of demand without a lot of supply, you see a 228% increase like we've seen with this Mickey Mantle example. All right, guys, let's look at one hockey card, or actually football. Let's go to football. Let's look at, I can't forget about football. We're going to go look at two of the quarterbacks from 1984 tops. We got Dan Marino and John Elway in PSA 10 and PSA 9. And since the start of the pandemic, these cards are up anywhere between 91% and all the way up to 351%. So these cards are still a lot higher than they were at the start of the pandemic. Do I think they have room to go down a little bit more as they've been dropping over the course of the last 2 years? I think they could go down a little bit more. Yes, I do. But long term, I still think that we're not terribly far from the bottom, and that these cards are going to have more value 5 years from now, most certainly, than they do today. Let's look at a hockey card. Let's look at Wayne Gretzky's famous 1979 O-Pee-Chee card. This one in PSA 8. And we're looking at this, and over the course of the pandemic, this card is up 118%. So once again, this is a card that I think is probably getting relatively close to its floor. It was $5,100 before the pandemic. It's $11,125 today. It could dip below $10,000. It could. I don't see it going a lot lower than that. Probably $8,000 would be about the lowest I would think this card would ever go for in today's market conditions before you see it start to rise again. Now let's look at a couple of players currently playing. Now these are harder to analyze because you've got other factors at play. You've got the performance of the player, what has happened with them, what has happened with their team, etc. So LeBron is a great example. Would you believe that LeBron's 2003 Topps Chrome base card in PSA 10 is actually less today than it was at the start of the pandemic? This iconic LeBron card, the PSA 10 of his Topps Chrome, was about $6,600 right before the pandemic, and today it's $5,800. It's down almost 12% since March 10th of 2020, since the start of the pandemic. Now, why is that? Well, don't forget that back in 2020, LeBron was with the Lakers, and the Lakers were on their way to winning their first NBA title with LeBron, right? So that was there was a lot of interest in LeBron's cards because he had moved to the Lakers. The Lakers were doing really, really great that season. They would eventually win the NBA title in the bubble. So that's part of the reason his cards were a little high going into the pandemic to begin with. So they've had maybe more room to fall. Also, some people are just turned off by LeBron, right? Some people don't like his politics or the way that he presents himself, and that has maybe hurt his cards a little bit as well. Personally, with him about to break the all-time NBA scoring record, which will probably happen here in the next 30 to 60 days, I personally really like where the price of this card is. It's $5,800 today. I have a hard time believing that this card will ever go below $5,000. I believe that this LeBron 2003 Topps Chrome PSA 10 has got to be near its floor right now. This is my opinion. Could I be wrong? Absolutely, I could be wrong. But that's what I think when I look at the charts of this card and when I look at LeBron about to break that scoring title. All right, let's look at another guy currently playing, Steph Curry. His cards have fared much, much better than LeBron's over the last couple of years. They are way up. Now, why is that the case? Well, we know the Warriors just won another championship. We also know that Curry became the all-time three-point leader in the NBA at the beginning of 2022. So those two factors have come into play and have really caused Curry's cards to ride strong. Where will they go from here? Could they dip? A lot of it probably comes down to how Golden State performs as this year goes on and how they perform in upcoming years. I still really like Curry. I still think that Curry's cards are very low population compared to most other basketball players playing the game today, because 2009 was a very low point for the production of basketball cards, his rookie year. So I still like Curry as an investment, but I do recognize that these cards could come down quite a bit if the Warriors flame out and then aren't very relevant in the upcoming seasons. All right, let's take a look at Luka. Luka is an interesting example because this is such an amazingly high population card, and that will forever hurt the value of this card. This is his Prism-based PSA 10. This card has a population of close to 20,000. It's almost 19,000 of that card right now in existence. And since the beginning of the pandemic, this card is down over 36%. You can see the impact that having such a high population of this card is having on the market, despite the fact that Luka's play has been progressively getting better, and he's probably having his best season ever. His cards are down over 36% since the beginning of the pandemic. This card in particular, and frankly a lot of his cards, are going to have a difficult time in the future simply because there were so many of them produced. So he's got to overcome that. The demand really has to be high to overcome the supply problem on cards like Luka from the last 4 or 5 years. All right, a couple more to look at, guys. Let's look at Mike Trout. Let's look at his 2011 Topps base rookie card in PSA 10 condition. Now, Trout's cards are almost right at where they were before the pandemic. On March 10th of 2020, this card was just over $1,600. Today, it's $1,675. It's right around the price that it was before the pandemic. Obviously, the Angels have underperformed in many people's eyes. He's not been able to get into the playoffs, and he's had some injury problems, even though he does continue to play really, really well when he's healthy and on the field. So we'll see where his cards go, but it is interesting that right now they're right where they were at the start of the pandemic. One more to look at. Let's look at Tom Brady. Let's look at the GOAT of football quarterbacks. We're looking at his 2000 Bowman Chrome in PSA 10 and PSA 9. And both of these cards are still pretty far up from where they were at the beginning of the pandemic. The PSA 10 is up 167%. The PSA 9 is up 275%. What are these cards going to do? I think they could fall a little further, just because obviously I don't expect the Bucs to have any success in the postseason this year, even though they did make the postseason. So, he looked good in the last game. They made the postseason. I don't expect them to have any success in the postseason. Who knows where he'll end up next year? Who knows when he's going to retire? These are still high compared to the floor, but don't forget that he won a Super Bowl during the pandemic, and that's part of the reason why these cards are high compared to the floor that they were at. So could they come back some? I think they might come back some, but I also think these are super great, wonderful cards to hold on to for the long term. So based on everything I just showed you, while I'm not sure we're at the bottom of the sports card market quite yet, and some of these cards I do think could come down a little more, I do think we're getting pretty darn close to the bottom of the market for many key cards. I don't believe that there is room for many of these cards that I showed you to drop in price a lot further before they plateau and inevitably start to rise again. And look, I understand it's easy to get caught up in the negativity of the last 2 years. When prices are dropping and we're all seeing the value of our collections diminish, it's easy to get down and think the worst. But that won't continue forever. And I think you will be pleasantly surprised by how the sports card market will rally back in the not too distant future. Now, there are a few big X factors at play here that could throw off my theory, either in a good way or a bad way. So one bad possibility is that the overprinting of cards the last few years will continue to persist. I do think that it's possible that cards from 2018 and 2019 will fall below their pre-pandemic prices. Some, like that Luka card I showed you, already have, simply because of the high number of cards that were printed. And all cards from 2020, 2021, and 2022 could suffer long term because of this same issue. Demand has to be really, really high to maintain a high price for a card with a population of 10,000 or more, or for a player who has 2,000 different rookie cards, which we've seen a lot of in the last few years. In general, I think that cards printed in 2017 and prior are relatively safe, but the printing presses really started rolling in 2018, especially for basketball cards and for baseball cards as well. So I'd be skeptical of a lot of cards from the last 4 years as long-term investments. Another good or bad X factor could be what happens with a recession. Some still predict that there is a really nasty recession right around the corner, while others believe that it's going to be short-lived and mild. A heavy recession could throw all markets downwards, including sports cards. If we get into a bad recession, then card prices could fall below their March 2020 levels. I personally don't believe this is going to happen, but only time will tell. Now, conversely, if the recession is short-lived and mild, you could see a rally in financial markets later this year, which could be good news for sports card prices as well. Another good or bad X factor will be how the Fed changes interest rates this year. I think interest rates rising had a sharp negative effect on the sports card market this last year, particularly on the high end. There were some big high-end collectors that were buying cards on margin. They were taking out secured loans against their collections to buy more cards. But as card prices dropped and interest rates climbed, some of those collectors had to or were forced to sell off their cards to pay down their loans. This is in part why you saw a flood of ultra-rare high-end cards hit the market for sale in late 2022. If interest rates start to drop again sometime this year, you'll likely see less high-end sports card sell-offs, and some investors may again start borrowing to buy cards, which boosts the market in the short term, at least for certain cards. A good X factor will be Fanatics' influence in the years ahead. Fanatics is committed to investing a ton of money into the marketing of sports cards and trying to significantly grow the consumer base for sports cards. But the impact of their investments and work will not be felt for some time to come. So there are a lot of X factors that could affect things in a good or bad direction. But overall, as I look at the charts and graphs and transaction data, I am optimistic. I believe that we're not too far away from prices rising again and the optimism returning to the sports card market. And I look forward to that day, and I hope and think it will be here before you know it. Now, if you are interested in tracking the sports card market and the value of your collection and having access to price charts for more than 1 million sports cards and non-sports cards such as Marvel, Star Wars, Pokemon, and more, then you need Market Movers. Market Movers is what we use here on all of our shows at Sports Card Investor, and you can get 7 days free of Market Movers by going to sportscardinvestor.com and clicking on Market Movers in the main menu bar. What do you think about my theory and the sports card market in 2023? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video and would like more videos like this, please hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed to our channel. I appreciate you watching. Have a great year. Have a wonderful day. Take care.